Hello and welcome to this edition of the Ridgefield Playhouse Diversity Film Series bonus content. I am your host, Cheryl Washington. Always delighted to be here because we always get a chance to talk about great films with great guests, and today is no exception. I'm going to be talking with someone who I just met, and I feel like she's my new best friend, Jill Buck. Jill, it's so nice to have you with us. But we're going to talk today about Women's History Month, and we're talking specifically about the film Erin Brockovich, which we're going to discuss in just a few minutes. But let me just let our audience know a little bit about you, Jill. Okay, I think I need to give you a very proper introduction because to me, you're the preeminent authority about all things environment. So you're the founder of Go Green Initiative, which is a global leader in environmental education. You're the host of Go Green Radio, which can be heard on voiceamerica.com, co-author of 47 Things You Can Do for the Environment, and you lead a consulting firm to help businesses go green and achieve profitability through sustainability. And if that's not enough, you're just an all-around good person who's helping our planet. So I'm very happy to talk to you, Jill. A real pleasure to have you on our Ridgefield Playhouse Diversity Film Series. How are you doing today?
Really well. And thank you so much, Cheryl. When you say it all together, it makes me sound like I should take a nap or something. I didn't do all those things at once.
At the same
So, but
time, but
thank you. Yeah.
but nonetheless, you are certainly someone who is very accomplished and skilled, and we want to talk to you about all of those things as well. But let's talk first a little bit about the film because this film truly is something that we all have rallied around. And since we're talking about Women's History Month in particular, this is about a gutsy woman, Erin Brockovich. I mean, I don't even know if it gets any gutsier than that. I mean, she really took on a multi-billion-dollar industry and handled her business and handled the business of what? 634 people in the Hinckley, California environment, correct?
That's right. That's
All right.
right. And she reminds us of what we see today and what we've seen throughout human history. Women are the conscience of society, and she served as the conscience for those who, might have backed down, might not have pressed so hard for us to see the kind of results that she catalyzed. And I think it's such a great representation of what women are willing to do, not just what they can do, but what they're willing to do, put it all on the line for the betterment of society, especially children.
Especially children. But you know the thing about her that I found very interesting, and I want to ask you this question also. Did you ever meet her? Have you ever had any kind of contact with her?
Only on Twitter.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
She's aware of you clearly.
Well, I believe so. We've come close to crossing paths on many occasions, and in fact, the industry, that she was working so hard to correct and to uh, find justice with for those folks in Hinkley, is actually my utility service provider in Northern California, PG&E.
Mhm.
So, we have definitely been on parallel paths in many instances.
Well, talk about the contamination of water that really took
Yeah.
place in that area and a $333 million settlement. And what I
Yeah.
was reading about this, because I was so struck by what took place, was, you think about moms and children and how
Mhm.
this affects them in particular. And I'm not trying to isolate them from anybody else, but when you talk about those circumstances that really did wreak havoc on their medical history, that company really should have come to task with what took place. And for her, Erin Brockovich, to have really gone beyond the call of duty to make certain that people were going to be, well, they were going to be taken for accountability, but that the people were going to be compensated for their bad decisions. So tell me
Right.
what your thoughts were about the movie, and did you find it as accurate as it appeared to be? Because I do remember reading about Erin saying that it was true, but
Mhm.
it was about only 98% accurate. So what are your impressions of the film?
I think in terms of the issues of environmental pollution and contamination, that's where the accuracy is pretty spot on. Unfortunately, Cheryl, we are still fighting to have chromium 6 as well regulated all these years later in California as we thought it would be after that case blew up. And now we're dealing with an even more serious water contamination issue, and that's PFAS. So it's amazing to me that we still have instances of corporate pollution and corporate culpability for some egregious water contamination, which is, water's not a luxury. We absolutely need it to survive, and
Exactly.
our water is under attack from a number of different sources. And the contamination that our local water agencies have to deal with is getting outrageously expensive. And until there's some relief, some compensatory relief for some of these contaminants, not just for people who've been victimized from a
Mhm.
health perspective, but for water agencies who are trying to filter this stuff out, it's up to water ratepayers, everyday citizens, to pay to clean up the messes of corporate polluters. And that is still the case. We are not done with that, even though Erin did such a great job in shining a light on that back in the day. We are still fighting that fight, not just in California, but across the country.
I was just going to ask you because there has to be more communities than Hinckley, California that are
Oh, yeah.
exposed to this. And when I think about it, just a few years back, I remember Flint, Michigan having
Yes,
so many issues with their water. So, I mean, this is not an isolated case clearly at all.
not at all. Jackson, Mississippi, most
Jack,
recently.
yes.
And the thing is, we tend to hear about these kinds of issues in environmental justice communities, and they're far more prevalent in environmental justice communities. But the fact is, there are perfectly affluent suburban cities that are dealing with water contamination on this scale as well. It's
Mhm.
really not, water flows, and it doesn't respect boundaries between socioeconomic levels of any kind. And so when contaminants enter into an upstream location, they flow downstream to whomever is down south of where the contamination happened. And in the case of a lot of these PFAS contamination problems, we're seeing that it has seeped into the groundwater. So we're actually pumping it out
Mhm.
of groundwater, um, you know, uh, aquifers.
Mhm.
And once you contaminate an aquifer, it is so difficult to clean that up and remediate that. And that's what's actually happened with PFAS, even more than it being in surface water, which is what we saw with the chromium 6.
So, how much should we be concerned about this kind of situation? Should we be as alarmed as we saw in the movie? Because I'm thinking that my natural, and I'm using that word kind of in parentheses, if you will, or quotations, the water that I consume and the water that we typically consume, should we be that fearful about it?
I don't recommend fear. I recommend information. Absolutely every single water agency in the United States is required to produce a consumer confidence report, or
Mhm.
CCR, that they have to publish every year. And every single person who gets their water, unless you get it from your own private
Mhm.
well, if you get it from a municipal water supply or a large water agency, you can get a hold of that consumer confidence report and see exactly what's in your water. But I also recommend that for some of these things that can end up in our water, this is what happened in Flint. There was no lead in the source water. What
Mhm.
happened was that water, that source water, when they switched over to a new source of water for that town, it was corrosive. So the lead got into the water because the corrosive water corroded the water filters or the water
Mhm.
fixtures that had lead in them, not the water itself, but the water fixtures. So when people consumed it, that corrosive water had gone through those lead fixtures,
Right.
and had the corrosion had just, broken up pieces of lead into their water. So even if your consumer confidence report shows that there's nothing in the source water, I recommend testing your water. You can get kits for certain types of contaminants, especially lead, because that is a very serious contaminant. And until you test your home water fountains, you just don't know.
You
And
don't know.
schools as well.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
So
So
don't
then,
be fearful.
yeah,
Be
be
proactive.
proactive, right? So let me ask you. I hate to ask a dumb question, but how do we go about doing that? How can the average person know how to do that so that they are safe?
That's right. Well, actually, the EPA is my favorite source of information. The EPA has a whole a huge amount of resources for drinking water, and they talk to you about how to test your home water for certain things. And they have very good instructions. They have very good resources that walk you through the steps. You can also go to a Home Depot, a Lowe's, your local hardware store, and ask them to show you where the water tests are, and you can buy one and send it away for testing.
That seems simple enough.
It is.
So now you've got me thinking that maybe that's what I need to be doing
Yeah,
because I never thought about it until you talked about it now. Going back to the movie though, because I want to
yeah,
talk to you
absolutely.
and ask you the question about, because the numbers are kind of jarring to me because we heard about chromium 6. Yet chromium 3 was supposed to be somewhat substantial. So tell me, Jill, how does that factor into why the contamination was so severe? 3 versus 6. I mean, does that matter?
It does, and the same is true in other contaminants. There are different types of PFAS chemicals. There are
Okay.
hundreds, in fact, and each of them, because they have a different chemical makeup, can have a different impact on the body. And so, Chrome 3 could have some short-term impacts, but Chrome 6, because of its chemical makeup, had a completely different impact and a much more long-lasting impact on human health than
Mhm,
Chrome 3. The same thing is true with some of the PFAS contamination that we're seeing in different parts of the country. There's PFOA, there's PFOS, there's several other kinds, and each of them are being studied by the CDC.
mhm,
And they have a range of human health implications. And
mhm,
so it really does matter, even when you're talking about something that seems so close together, like Chrome
mhm.
3 and Chrome 6, our bodies just react differently to those different chemicals. And one of the things that's so important to know is that some of these contaminants in our water, and PFAS is one, lead is another.
Mhm.
Some of these are bioaccumulative toxins, which
What does that
means
mean?
that means that they build up in your body. They don't just flush out. And so the level of those chemicals in your body builds up over time. And that's why it's so important to protect children from this, because we want them to have a nice long life. And the longer they are drinking, these types of bioaccumulative toxins in their water, the more chance they have to have adverse health impacts, because their cumulative levels of these toxins build up in their bodies. And that's what causes the dire parts, the most difficult parts of the human health impacts.
Jill, you're making me feel afraid, and I'm trying to keep it together. But when you talk about what can potentially happen in our human bodies, that's very alarming and very daunting. What
Mhm.
can we do to offset this?
Right. Well, a lot of people will say, well, I'll just buy bottled water. And the bad news is that bottled water is less regulated than our tap water. That's not a guarantee.
Mhm.
Bottled water does not guarantee you these things. I mean, I'm the kind of person who shows up at meetings. I show up at my water agency meetings. I show up at city council meetings, and I ask questions of my public policy makers. In the end, clean drinking water is a matter of public policy. It's also a matter of public investment.
Mm.
So if your water agency says, hey, we need to pass a bond measure because we need to put in a PFAS contamination treatment plant, well, before you just vote no, educate yourself
Mm.
on what the consequences could be to your community if you don't put in that water treatment plant, if you don't upgrade your water infrastructure. This is what happened in Jackson, Mississippi.
Mhm. Yeah.
There wasn't enough advocacy, and there weren't enough people in the public policy making decision making roles to advocate for what was best for the community and invest in water infrastructure. A lot of our water infrastructure is old, Cheryl, and we've got to understand as Americans that in order to keep clean drinking water, we're going to have to keep upgrading and keep modernizing our water treatment facilities and our water infrastructure, and that will cost us money.
It's money. Yeah. Yeah. You're talking a lot about educational issues and how we need to educate ourselves, but also because of your initiative, your Go Green initiative, you actually go to the schools and you explain and
Yep.
you demonstrate and you are proactive about what people need to do, going into schools to make certain that students are equipped with the information. So
Yep.
tell me how is, I mean, you seem like such a very smart woman and you
Thank
have a
you.
lot going on. But tell me, how did you first of all become involved in this, and why aren't we doing more in
Yeah.
our educational system to make people aware of what these issues are and how we can mitigate them?
I think that's a great question, and I appreciate you asking. I mean, I got involved as a young mom when I
Mhm,
started to realize that there were environmental toxins in schools that my
mhm,
kids were exposed to, and that's where they spent most of their waking days. They were exposed to environmental toxins in the air, the water, and the food that was being served at schools. And when I looked around to find out who was working on that, I found that there was no one. And so, what are you going to do? I wrote a program to help address that, and then we started spreading it throughout the country. And I initially got a lot of support from PTAs, from Texas State PTA, Illinois, Pennsylvania, New York. Several state PTAs got on board with this because it's a big group of child advocates. And that's what I saw this as a
mhm,
program that was centered on what was best for children. And so I think part of the reason that we don't see more of this going on in schools is twofold. First of all, there's a whole lot of organizations that are developing curriculum and they're just throwing it at teachers as fast as they can
mhm,
and seeing who has time to work in the instructional minutes for these, for these curriculum pieces. But what's not happening is that senior district administrators in schools are not being taught that this is a problem.
mhm,
They try to comply with the law, but I mean, think about this, Cheryl. We've known for decades that
mhm.
lead poisoning in water can cause children irreparable
Of course,
brain damage,
of
and yet
course.
there's no federal mandate to test for water, test lead in the water at schools. So this is a problem on the regulatory side, but it's also a problem on the professional development side. All of these folks who are getting masters and doctorates in education and then become superintendents and senior district administrators aren't being taught that this is something they need to take care of. So my
Mhm.
organization it ends up doing a lot of professional development for senior school district administrators. And until the regulatory environment catches up with us, it's an uphill battle
Yeah,
because it
yeah.
simply isn't being underscored for those people who are in leadership positions in the K through 12 system.
So you take them to task, which is a good thing to do. And I remember we talked even off camera before we came on to our segment here that Newark is one of the municipalities where you're doing a lot of
Mhm.
work with. And I recall that there were some lead problems
Yeah.
in Newark maybe several years ago.
Yep.
So tell me what your organization, what your foundation has been doing to help underscore the problem and to
Yeah.
try to help that go away, if you will.
Absolutely. Well, I have to credit the mayor. He's the former principal of Central High School in Newark. And
Okay.
so he already had a predisposition to care about
Mhm.
kids and their well being. And they are the most vulnerable to lead. And when he found out how prevalent the lead problem was in his city, he went to the state house and he got the money and he got the manpower and the woman power to get those pipes replaced and was incredibly proactive.
Mhm.
So I really have to say that Mayor Baraka was the
The
true
champion,
leader.
right?
Yes,
Uh-huh.
he sure
Mhm,
was.
mhm,
But
mhm,
behind him were a lot of people that he had worked with in the school district who were saying, we have children with lead poisoning in our classrooms. They're having a hard time. They can't concentrate.
mhm,
They have trouble with behavior, and
mhm,
this is a huge multi-generational problem. We have
mhm,
got to stop the source of this lead poisoning of our community. And so there were a lot of educators who really worked with him and prompted him to do that. And so I really have to give him all the props for getting a hold of that and not letting go and not letting the state house, not
mhm.
letting the Capitol off the hook. Um, they got it done
Good, good,
together.
good, good. And I know because of what you do, in addition to the Go Green initiative, that you also stand behind students who are doing more with this. Is it a leadership program that
It
helps
is.
students get more engaged? Can you just share with us
You bet.
the foundation of that, if you will?
You bet. Well, back in 2015, I started a program for high school students called Local Leaders of the 21st Century. And it was based on the idea that, hey, you know what? This is complicated. There's a reason why more people don't show up to their water agency or city council meetings advocating for good environmental public policy at the community level. It's complicated.
Mhm,
And if we're going to raise the next generation of students who know how to do that, who feel confident and educated and empowered to go to a water agency meeting and say, I'm not sure that our water is safe. In fact, I know it's not. I've seen consumer confidence report, and I see higher and elevated levels of certain contaminants, and I want to know what you're going to do to address it. We need to have students who understand where their water comes from, where it goes, where their energy comes from, where it goes, where their food comes from, and where it goes. Because when it goes to a landfill, it creates methane, which is a greenhouse gas. So we got involved in helping students understand some of those local issues when it comes to their environment, and how does your local environment and public policy work. And then we train them up to get out into the community and tell others about it and educate
Mm.
residents about everything from how to recycle right to how to conserve water and everything in between. And we ensure that they have the knowledge and the skills to do great presentations in, influential, persuasive presentations in their own communities, and they feel very empowered to keep doing that. A lot of times high school students, their idea of activism is make a poster and march. And
Right.
that's okay. There's room for that. There's a time and a place for that. But we've helped students see that they can have even more impact on
Impact.
public
Yeah.
policy by doing it this way, and by engaging public policymakers directly.
So now is this throughout the whole country that you're doing this, or is this just limited to your area?
No, we have clubs all over the country. We have two actually in Newark,
All
two
right.
high schools, and we are continuing to expand. One of the things that's important to know, Cheryl, is that we don't charge school districts anything for any of our services, and yet we pay a lot of money. We have staff, we pay interns. We do all those things. So we fundraise so that we can do more and more work in more and more communities. So to the extent that we are able to fund those clubs, we're going to keep expanding them until every high school that wants one has one.
I'm so glad to hear you say that because I'm both a journalist and an educator. And so this makes me feel very good about what you're doing to help everyone get more involved and more engaged in the process. I think that it's so important. And coming from a standpoint of an urban environment,
Yep.
we don't always see that happening. And so
Yep.
I'm so glad that you're making more inroads so that communities like Newark, for
Yep.
example, are doing what they're supposed to do. They're doing their due justice, if you will. Now, in terms of your, because you do this consultancy as well, so you're also helping corporations and different businesses to move forward in this direction too. How do you go about doing that?
Well, it kind of depends on their needs. In the
Mhm.
last 10 years, I'd say that a lot of companies have, gotten a hold of some of these, what they call ESG metrics, environmental, social, and governance metrics, that just recently became something that is becoming more required. It used to be something that was voluntary.
Mhm.
So a company might get a survey from another business they do business with, somebody in their supply chain, asking them questions about how much water and energy they use, and telling them about their social programs and their workforce programs. And companies would say, what is this? What's going on? And
Right.
so I would help them understand where ESG metrics came from. Now the SEC is requiring quarterly reporting along these lines. And so more and more companies are beginning to adopt environmental, social, and governance metrics. And one of the things we're also seeing is that companies know that this is a big risk. If they are a company, let's say, that's very water intensive, and they are operating in a community that's in a mega drought,
Mhm.
that's not a great
Yeah, yeah.
that's
Not
risky.
good.
That's
Right,
risky.
right. Yeah.
And their investors know that too. So some of these metrics are really getting down to brass tacks, like, are you operating in a way that is sustainable, not just globally,
Mhm,
but
mhm.
in the communities in which you are operating, and considering the resources they have available. I mean, if you are, like, I read an article recently about, some data servers and, these big server banks using more water than the residents of the community in which they're placed. And that's a tough sell.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
companies have to be much more aware of their environmental footprint, not just globally, but certainly right there at home where their operations take place.
Of course. Going back to the movie for just a moment, because I want to talk to you about the intensity of getting these contaminants out of the water. So I would imagine that's such an arduous process, and it takes
Yep.
years to develop that, right? What is the nature of it? Can you just kind of walk
Yeah.
us through how that works, Jill?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a few technologies that are available now. There's ion exchange,
Mhm.
there's granular activated carbon, GAC, really fancy name there. And
Sounds
there's reverse.
disgusting, actually.
I know it sounds like a noise my
Right,
dog makes when he's not feeling well,
right.
but it's actually quite effective.
Okay, good, good, good to know.
And then there's reverse osmosis.
Mhm,
These are three of the big categories of water treatment.
mhm,
um, reverse osmosis is very effective. It's kind of like running water through a filter, a very small filter at high
mhm,
pressure. It's energy intensive. um, GAC and ion exchange are good technologies for some contaminants as well. But one of the
mhm,
issues that we're seeing even here in my hometown, which is dealing with PFAS to a large degree, is that when you have maybe centralized PFAS treatment facilities and you have to move the water a couple of miles to the facility, then turn around and move the treated water back to the
mhm,
community from the treatment hub. Water is very heavy and it
mhm,
uses a lot of energy to move it. And so, again, that becomes very energy intensive. And at a time when we're trying to, decarbonize our
mhm,
energy grid, go to more renewable energy, the kind of energy that's required to run these treatment facilities it can be a very difficult thing to pencil out when communities are looking at their energy baseload and trying to get to rein it in,
mhm,
so that they can meet some of their climate action goals. So the other piece of this is that each of these technologies, reverse osmosis,
mhm.
granulated carbon, and ion exchange, create a byproduct. So when you strain out these contaminants, you're left with some material that's highly contaminated,
Okay.
highly potent. And the question becomes, what do we do with it?
Yeah, yeah.
Do we put it in a landfill? Well, that's not going to solve the
That's not
problem.
feasible. No, right.
That's going to
Yeah.
let it
Mhm,
perhaps get right back into the environment.
mhm,
So we're
mhm.
still trying to figure out what to do with the material that's left once we run the water through these treatment facilities and we pull out the contaminants and we have the contaminants in our hand. What do we do with it? What's the safe way to dispose of it? And frankly, there's not a great
There
answer
isn't.
for that.
Right, 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 right. I would think not. Well,
Mhm.
another question I wanted to ask you, because the folks in Hinckley who were in the midst of that horror,
Yeah.
many of them have moved away out of their community, but some stayed. Some elected to stay. And I'm just wondering, do we know, because this is what, maybe 30 years after the
Mhm.
fact, do we know what the outcome of that situation is in terms of the folks who were a part of that horrible process? Has
Yeah.
there been any data that has been discussed?
I'm sure that there has. I know Hinckley's still there. I drove through
Right.
it about a
Oh,
month
did you?
ago.
Oh, really?
It's not a ghost town.
Okay.
And I don't have the data for that at my
Mhm,
fingertips, but
mhm,
some people did stay. And this is the hard thing, Cheryl. You may have a contaminant in your water that, for reasons we can't explain, just don't make some people
mhm,
sick. And
mhm,
then on the other hand, they make some people so sick they don't make it. And that is the difficult sell. There are
yeah,
still some people in my town, even though we've had PFAS for a few years, who are like, is it really harmful? I've been drinking the tap water and I feel
mhm,
fine. And
mhm,
that's their standard of whether or not they need to get excited about getting contaminants out of their water. And it's just not a great standard because we're not all treated equally when it comes to what those contaminants do to our bodies. So some people did stay.
mhm,
Water has been treated, and California is still grappling with
mhm.
what to do with some
Yes.
of these contaminants. So the story's not over, not for Hinckley and not for the whole state of California, because Chrome 6 is still a thing.
Right, right. And I would think that Erin Brockovich is still doing her thing there to make
She
sure that
is.
the
Oh,
feisty woman that
you
she is, right?
you gotta follow her on Twitter. You've got to follow her. She is,
Well,
she is a
thank goodness
force.
this movie came out when it did. And I would think that it's even more relevant today in
Absolutely.
2023 than it was back in 2000 when it first
Yep,
premiered. So, I mean, we have some things that we still have a lot of work to do. That's basically what
we
we're
do.
saying, Jill, right? We have a
We
lot of
do.
work to do.
We
Yeah.
need to pay attention. I mean, it really is. I can remember my grandparents going to city council meetings like it was a social thing. We've kind
Mhm.
of gotten away from that. And
Mm,
the lack of citizen oversight in some of these public policy decisions is exactly the
mhm,
variable that is needed to
mhm,
push public policymakers, and not just push. There's also an encouragement that public policymakers receive when people show up and say, hey, I am willing to pay 2 cents more per
mhm.
gallon for cleaner water. And so I support you. Make this decision. I support you. So it's not all about controversy. Sometimes it's about showing up to encourage our public policymakers and let them know we're behind you. This is the right thing to do. So I think citizen engagement is a
It's
huge
our
factor.
responsibility.
It just is. It
Yeah,
just is.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah. Jill, you're so full of knowledge. I could talk to you forever. Can I just ask one more question? 'Cause I know that you're the co-author of the book, 47 Things We Can Do. I may not have the exact title. Wait, I got to get it though. 47 Things You Can Do for the Environment. Listen, I recycle. That's one thing. But
That's
tell
perfect.
me,
That's great.
okay, but tell me what is just give me like a top three, which we can do.
Yep, absolutely. So, for most people, saving energy is the number one thing you can do to help your community become less of an emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. And frankly, Cheryl, we haven't talked about climate change today, but
Mhm,
that is a looming
mhm.
human
Yeah,
suffering inducing situation.
absolutely,
So,
absolutely.
saving energy, whether that means saving it at your home, clumping all of your errands together so you use less gas while you're running errands, whatever way you can save energy is a big one. The world is getting a little bit more difficult when it comes to dealing with food waste. We know now that throwing away food that could have been eaten
Mhm.
is actually something that contributes to climate change as well. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. So if you throw your food away, it ends up in the landfill and creates methane, and it's 81 times more potent than carbon. So
Oh God.
cut down on that food waste. Okay. There's
Okay.
lots of ways to do it. Save energy, cut down on food waste, and I would say treat your water like it's precious. Think about water as a finite natural resource because clean water is a finite natural resource, and treat it with care. Look into it, understand what's happening in your community, and get involved. We can't live without water.
We can't.
And
Our precious commodity.
that's right. We need water
We
champions.
need it absolutely. Jill, you are a fountain of no pun intended of information. I just thought about that. But clearly, you have so much information that I hope that we're all taking stock of. And I certainly know that from my perspective, I will do better and I will do more. And I thank you
Great.
so much for joining us on this segment of our Richfield Playhouse Diversity Film Series because you have given us great nuggets for sure. Thank you, Jill Buck. We're going to be hearing a lot more from you, I know. And I should probably tell you also, and as I thank our sponsor, Aquarian Water Company, that's a good one, Jill, just letting you know, okay?
There you
They are
go.
doing the job and they're doing it most effectively. So we want to thank you and obviously thank our sponsor, Aquarian Water Company, for this edition of our Diversity Film Series. Jill, all the best to you. Happy Women's History Month, and we'll be talking to you again, I'm sure.
Thank you. And
All
same
the
to you,
best to you.
Cheryl.
Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
thank you, everyone, for watching us. And we will see you again on the next edition of our program. Thank you so much.